Damien Cross set down his champagne glass, looked his wife of 9 years directly in the eyes, and said, "This is embarrassing. Even the catering staff have more dignity than you right now." He said it quietly, almost gently, which made it worse. Vanessa had just asked him, on their anniversary, if they could leave the party early. Just the two of them. He didn't even bother lowering his voice when Sabrina Vale laughed behind her wine glass. Vanessa stood there in a borrowed dress in her own home, and something in her chest stopped moving. Not broke, just stopped. Like a clock someone finally decided wasn't worth winding anymore. If you've ever watched someone disappear while still standing right in front of you, stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The penthouse at 840 Park Avenue had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire Manhattan skyline. On clear nights, the city spread beneath it like a circuit board lit up and humming. All that electric ambition packed into glass and steel, and the kind of altitude that made ordinary people feel small just looking up. Vanessa Hale had loved those windows once. When she and Damien first moved in, 11 years ago, she used to press her forehead against the cold glass on winter mornings and feel like she was floating above the noise of the world, like the city belonged to her in some small way, like she did too. She didn't do that anymore. Now she moved through the penthouse the way you move through a place that no longer quite belongs to you, carefully, without taking up too much space, aware of every surface she touched. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, had started setting Vanessa's coffee on the kitchen counter instead of the breakfast nook 2 years ago. A small thing. Probably unconscious. But Vanessa had noticed. She noticed everything now. When you've been made invisible long enough, you develop a kind of radar for the exact shape of your own disappearance. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the specific Tuesday happened, the one she would later mark as the last one. Damien was on the phone before he was even dressed. He stood in the walk-in closet in his undershirt, selecting a tie with one hand and gesturing at some invisible boardroom with the other, his voice carrying the particular clipped authority he used when someone on the other end had disappointed him. Vanessa sat on the edge of the bed, already dressed, holding a small envelope in both hands. She'd been holding it for 40 minutes. Inside was a card she'd written herself, the old-fashioned way, with a fountain pen she'd had since art school. She'd gone through 4 drafts. She wasn't sure the 5th one was right either, but she'd stopped trying to make it perfect. On the front, she had pressed a small dried leaf, burnt orange, nearly translucent, from the tree in Central Park where they'd had their first real conversation 14 years ago. He'd been on his phone then too, but he'd looked up. He'd looked at her. Back then he looked at her like she was something he couldn't quite believe was real. She had written, 9 years. I still choose you. Do you still choose me? She knew it was a dangerous question. She asked it anyway because some part of her needed the answer more than she needed to be safe from it. Damien came out of the closet still on the phone, and she stood up. He walked past her to the bathroom. She followed him to the doorway. Damien? He held up one finger without looking at her. She waited. 3 minutes. 4. He talked about server architecture and a funding round, and a lawyer's name she didn't recognize. Finally, he pulled the phone from his ear and set it face up on the marble counter and looked at her in the mirror. You're going to be late, he said. Don't you have that thing at the Whitmore Gallery? That was last week. Right. He turned on the faucet. She walked to where he was standing and held out the card. It's our anniversary. He looked at it. Then he looked at her face in the mirror, briefly, the way you glance at a notification you're going to ignore. I have a dinner with the Remington people tonight. I told you about that. You didn't. Vanessa. He said her name the way he said a lot of things now, like it was a small inconvenience that had grown tedious through repetition. I'm sure I told you. You didn't, Damien. I would have remembered. Are we really going to do this at 7:45 in the morning? She set the card on the counter beside his phone. I made a reservation. Rosario's. 8 o'clock. He laughed. A single exhale through his nose. Not a real laugh. The sound a person makes when they want you to feel slightly foolish for trying. I just told you I have a dinner. Then cancel it. I'm not canceling a $30 million conversation because you made a reservation at Rosario's. The envelope sat between them on the marble. Neither of them looked at it. When did you stop caring? She asked. She hadn't planned to say it, but there it was. He turned to face her directly for the first time that morning. There was something in his expression she recognized. Not cruelty exactly, more like the face of a man who has decided a conversation is pointless and is preparing to end it efficiently. "I care," he said. "I work 70 hours a week, so you can live in this apartment and buy whatever you want and not worry about anything. That's caring." "That's not what I'm asking." "Then I don't know what you're asking. I'm asking if you still love me." He stared at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. "We've been married 9 years. Of course I love you." "You don't look at me anymore." "Vanessa, you haven't looked at me, actually looked at me, in at least 2 years, maybe 3. I've been trying to figure out exactly when it happened, and I can't. This is not a conversation I have the bandwidth for right now." She felt something shift in her chest, not break. She'd felt things break before, early on, when she still cried about it. This was different, quieter, like a settlement, like when a building finally accepts the weight of what it's been carrying and stops pretending the cracks aren't there. "The Remington dinner," she said. "Is Sabrina Vale going to be there?" The pause was very small, almost imperceptible, but Vanessa had learned to read his silences the way some people learn to read weather, by the particular quality of stillness before a shift. "She's on the Remington board," he said. "So, yes, probably." "Probably. Why are you doing this?" "I'm asking a question. You're doing the thing you do where you ask questions you think you already know the answers to, and then act wounded when the answers aren't what you want." She picked the card up off the counter, held it in both hands for a moment. Then she set it down in the trash bin beside the sink, deliberately so he could see exactly what she was doing. He watched her do it and said nothing. "Have a good dinner," she said. She had known about Sabrina Vale for 14 months. She hadn't known in the dramatic, cinematic way. No lipstick on a collar, no incriminating text message glowing up from a nightstand. It had been more gradual than that, which in some ways was harder to contend with. A name that appeared in conversation once too often. A shift in the particular quality of Damien's absence, less like distraction and more like elsewhere. The way he showered immediately when he came home late. Small things. Accumulating. She'd hired a private investigator in February, not because she needed proof, but because she needed to stop second-guessing her own perception. The file the investigator delivered contained photographs and a 4-page summary she read in her car in a parking garage in Midtown, the engine still running. She sat there for 90 minutes. Then she drove home and made dinner and didn't say anything. What stopped her from confronting him wasn't fear. And it wasn't some calcified devotion to the marriage. It was something stranger than either of those things. A terrible clarity about what confrontation would produce. He would deny it, then minimize it, then suggest that her insecurities had driven him to it, and somehow she would end up managing his discomfort instead of her own devastation. She'd watched that script play out enough times in enough different ways to know she didn't have the stomach for the performance. So she waited, not passively, purposefully. She began making quiet arrangements. A savings account he didn't know about, funded carefully and slowly from the household budget. A storage unit in Brooklyn where she moved the few things that actually belonged to her. Her art school portfolio, her grandmother's jewelry, 3 boxes of photographs from before. She started running again, 4 miles every morning, not for any aesthetic reason, but because she needed to remember that her body belonged to her. She read books she'd been meaning to read for years and called her college roommate Petra, who she'd gradually lost touch with somewhere in the middle of the marriage. "I think I'm leaving," she told Petra, sitting on a bench in Riverside Park on a cold March afternoon. Petra was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been thinking about it?" "A while, but I think I've been waiting for permission." "From who?" "I don't know. From the situation, from him, from something that never came." "You don't need permission, Vanessa." "I know." She watched a woman walk by with 2 small children, both of them bundled in coats 2 sizes too big, the older one holding the younger one's hand with complete unconscious dedication. "I know I don't." The night of the anniversary, she came home to find the penthouse empty and dark. She'd known he wouldn't be there. She'd known since that morning. But there's knowing something, and then there's standing in a beautiful apartment at 8:30 at night with your coat still on, surrounded by every expensive, impersonal thing that constitutes a life you chose, and feeling the full, specific weight of what you've lost. Or maybe not lost, maybe surrendered piece by piece, so slowly you didn't notice the cost until the inventory came up empty. She walked to those windows she used to love and stood in front of them for a long time. The city was what it always was: indifferent, spectacular, unconcerned with any single person's particular heartbreak. 1,000 lit windows, 1,000 lives stacked up against each other, none of them touching. Her phone buzzed. A text from Damien. Running late. Don't wait up. She set the phone face down on the glass coffee table. Then she went to the bedroom closet and pulled out the suitcase she'd already half-packed 6 weeks ago, slid beneath a rack of coats he never looked at. She added a few more things. Practical things. The jewelry her grandmother left her. The folder of documents from the storage unit that she'd moved back in stages. Her passport. She didn't take any of the things they'd bought together. The art on the walls, some of it good, some of it expensive, which were not always the same thing, she left it. The clothes he'd bought her for events and dinners, she left those too. The life that had been constructed around the idea of being Damien Cross's wife, she left all of it. It fit surprisingly easily in the one suitcase. She called a car. While she waited, she sat down on the couch in the living room and looked at the apartment with the same careful attention she'd once given a canvas before starting work, studying the composition, the weight distribution, the places where things didn't quite balance. It was a beautiful apartment, cold and correct and beautiful, like a magazine spread of a life rather than the life itself. She thought about the card she'd thrown away that morning. I still choose you. Do you still choose me? She understood, sitting there, that she'd been asking the wrong question for a long time. The question wasn't whether Damien chose her. The question was whether she still chose herself, whether there was still enough of herself left to choose. The car arrived. She picked up the suitcase. She didn't look back at the windows. She took a bus to a town called Harlow, Massachusetts, because she'd seen the name on a map and it meant nothing to her, which was exactly what she needed. A place that carried no associations, no expectations, no version of Vanessa Hale that she would have to live up to or down from. Harlow was not a charming New England town, not the kind with a white church steeple and apple orchards and leaf-peeping tourists. It was the other kind, a former mill town that had been repurposed and half forgotten, its downtown 3 blocks of storefronts in various states of renovation and resignation, a river running behind the main street that had once powered the textile factories and now just ran. The people there worked in manufacturing and healthcare and construction and the regional school system, and they had the faces of people who had weathered things, which Vanessa found more comforting than she expected. She found a room to rent above a hardware store on Clement Street. The landlord was a 70-year-old man named Earl who asked no questions, charged $400 a month, and communicated primarily through brief nods. The room had one window, a slanted ceiling, a radiator that clanged and hissed through the night like something trying to escape, and walls the color of old mustard. She found it almost aggressively unbeautiful. She liked it immediately. She got a job at a diner called Pearl's 3 days after she arrived. Pearl herself was still alive, a formidable woman in her late 60s who moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had never once wasted emotion, and who had the particular gift of reading people quickly and keeping her opinions to herself. Pearl looked at Vanessa's application, which listed no food service experience and a 9-year gap in employment, and said, "You ever waitressed before?" "No." "You a hard worker?" "Yes." "You gonna call in sick on a Friday?" "No." "You got references?" "No." Pearl folded the application in half. "You start Monday, 6 to 2. Don't be late." Vanessa was not late. She was also terrible at waitressing for the first 3 weeks. She moved too carefully, second-guessed herself, apologized too much when she made mistakes. But she was relentlessly on time and relentlessly willing, and Pearl had a talent for seeing through the surface of people to the actual material underneath. "You're thinking too hard," Pearl told her one morning. "Table 4 wants eggs and toast, not a philosophical experience." "I know, you're treating every order like it's a test you might fail. It's a diner. Fail faster and move on." Vanessa looked at her. That's actually good advice for a lot of things. I know, Pearl said, and went back to the kitchen. Done. She bought art supplies at a craft store 40 minutes away in early November. A small set of acrylics, a few brushes, a pack of stretched canvases. She told herself it was just for her evenings, something to do in the mustard-colored room instead of watching too much television and thinking too hard. She hadn't painted seriously in a decade. In the early years of the marriage, she'd had a studio space in a shared building in Chelsea, and she'd worked there 3 days a week with real dedication. But Damien had begun commenting, gently at first, then less gently, that it seemed an expensive hobby for work that never sold, and the studio time had gradually compressed, and then she'd let the lease lapse temporarily, and the temporary had never ended. She sat up on the floor of her rented room with a sheet of plastic under the canvases, and the window cracked despite the cold. The first night she just stared at a blank canvas for an hour. She didn't know what she wanted to paint. She didn't know if she still had anything in her worth putting down. She picked up a brush and mixed a dark red, almost rust, and made a single horizontal mark across the middle of the canvas. Looked at it. Made another, darker. Then a gray. Then something close to black, but warmer, with just enough brown to keep it from feeling dead. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. What came out wasn't beautiful in any conventional way. It was dense and layered and a little chaotic. Textures built up on top of each other, colors that shouldn't have worked together, finding some grudging accommodation. But it had a quality she hadn't felt in something she'd made in years. It felt honest, unperformed, like the difference between saying what you mean and saying what you think people want to hear. She set it against the wall and looked at it for a long time. Then she started another one. Well, that winter was the hardest. Not because of poverty, exactly, though there was a real adjustment in what things could cost. It was more the interior weather, the long nights in that small room with the clanging radiator, and the weight of everything she'd walked away from pressing down on her in the dark. There were nights when the doubt came in like a physical force, and she would lie there cataloging her failures, her naivety, the 9 years she'd spent allowing herself to be reduced. There were mornings when she woke up, and the first thought was, I have nothing. And the second thought, after a moment's inventory, was, you chose this. Now figure out what to do with it. She called Petra every Sunday. Sometimes it helped and sometimes it didn't, but the constancy of it, someone who knew exactly who she was and where she'd come from, kept her from floating too far from herself. She did not call Damien. He called her twice in the first week. The calls brief and strange in tone, more confused than contrite, as if he hadn't quite worked out yet what emotion the situation called for. After that, his lawyer contacted her lawyer. She'd hired one before she left, a practical woman named Sandra Cho, who specialized in high-asset divorce and had the particular calm of someone who had seen every variation of this story and was impressed by none of them. He's offering a settlement, Sandra told her in early December. It's below what you're entitled to, but it's clean. What does clean mean? No public proceedings, no press. He doesn't want this in the papers. Vanessa thought about that. Is the number negotiable? Everything is negotiable. Then negotiate. I want enough to live on while I figure things out. I'm not trying to take his empire. I just want to not have to worry about the rent. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Vanessa, you were married to this man for 9 years. You declined employment during that time at his request. You supported his career socially, domestically, and logistically. You are legally entitled to considerably more than enough to cover rent. I know what I'm entitled to. Are you sure you want to leave this much on the table? I don't want his money. I want what's mine. Those are two different things. Well, what she walked away with was not nothing. Sandra had made certain of that, but it was a fraction of what the marriage had technically been worth. She accepted this without resentment. She understood that some exits cost more than others, and that the ones that cost the most in money sometimes cost the least in everything else. By spring, she had 17 canvases stacked against the wall of her room. The diner owner 2 streets over had a gallery space he wasn't using. Just a white room at the back of a building he owned, meant for community events and mostly vacant. His name was Ray Bourdette, and he'd been watching Vanessa come and go from the hardware store room for months. He'd seen her carry canvases in once, badly wrapped in garbage bags. He had a particular face when he asked if she'd ever thought about showing her work, careful and curious, and not quite willing to seem too interested. Here? She said. Here, he said. Nothing formal, just people come through. They look at things. Maybe something happens. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she said yes, mostly because the canvases were taking up too much of her floor space. The show, if it could be called that, ran for 2 weeks in April. 12 paintings. She priced them low because she felt fraudulent pricing them any other way. She sold 7 of them. 1 to a nurse from the hospital, 1 to a retired contractor who said the colors reminded him of his father's machine shop, 1 to a school teacher who stood in front of it for 20 minutes without speaking, and then wrote a check before she talked herself out of it. The school teacher's name was Britt Hayward. She came back the following week and they talked for an hour over bad coffee in the space. "Where did you train?" Britt asked. "RISD, a long time ago. Then I stopped." "Why?" Vanessa considered the question with more honesty than she usually allowed herself in that direction. "I let someone else decide that it wasn't worth doing." Britt looked at the paintings, the rust and the gray and the fractured, layered colors that somehow accumulated into something you couldn't look away from. "They were wrong," she said simply. Vanessa looked at the paintings too. "Yeah," she said. "I know that now." The years that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a life being reconstructed from good materials rather than assembled from what's convenient. She expanded her practice slowly and deliberately. A second show, better attended. A mention in a small regional arts magazine, a 3-sentence aside in a roundup piece that nonetheless sent 17 people to raise gallery space on a Wednesday afternoon. A larger show the following year at a real gallery in Providence, arranged through a contact of Britt's, who ran a contemporary arts program at the local university. She moved out of Earl's room into a converted loft on the east side of town with real north light and enough floor space to work large. She hired a part-time studio assistant, a recent art school graduate named Jonah, who was technically more skilled than her in certain processes, and had the good sense to be interested rather than competitive about the differences in their approaches. She was not an overnight success. She was something that takes longer and lasts, an artist whose reputation was built from actual encounter, one person to another, one painting to the next, the work accumulating weight and coherence and an unmistakable voice. Critics who wrote about her used words like uncompromising and viscerally honest, and from one reviewer who'd clearly been waiting to deploy the phrase ruthlessly beautiful. She ate that one up a little. She wasn't above it. In the 5th year, a collector from New York, a woman named Constance Hayward Penn, who bought and sold contemporary art with the serious attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at, came to see her in Harlow on a recommendation that had traveled through 3 intermediaries. Constance walked through the studio in silence for 40 minutes, while Vanessa drank coffee and didn't explain anything. At the end of the 40 minutes, Constance said, "I want to represent you." "In what capacity?" "Nationally? Internationally if it gets there, which it will." Vanessa set down her coffee. "Why?" Constance looked at her with a kind of direct assessment that Vanessa recognized as respect from someone who didn't offer it casually. "Because you have something that most artists spend their whole careers trying to learn and never quite get. You know what you're doing and you know why you're doing it, and those two things are in total alignment. It's rare, and people feel it." Vanessa thought about the room above the hardware store, and the blank canvas, and the rust-red mark she'd made across the middle of it on a cold November night 5 years ago with nothing behind her and nothing ahead of her, and only the question of whether she still had something worth saying. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Constance repeated. "Yes, let's do this." She did not follow Damien's life deliberately, but Manhattan was the world she came from, and the art world circled back to it constantly, and there was only so much avoiding the information that she could manage. Through Constance's orbit and the general ambient noise of the city's social media and the occasional call from Petra, who had no compunction about keeping her informed, she learned the general shape of what had happened. Damien and Sabrina had married 18 months after the divorce was finalized, a high-profile wedding covered by 3 publications, the photographs precisely engineered to project ease and glamour, and 2 people at the peak of their lives. Cross Tech had continued its expansion. Damien remained what he had always been: powerful, admired in certain rooms, considered a visionary by people who benefited from his vision. Sabrina was exactly what Vanessa might have predicted. Beautiful in the way that requires constant maintenance, socially magnetic in a way that was mostly technical skill, and perfectly matched to the version of Damien that Vanessa had watched emerge over the second half of their marriage. The version that valued surfaces and was suspicious of depth. Vanessa did not hate them. She'd worked through something more complicated than hate in those first months in Harlow, in those long nights with the clanging radiator and the canvases lined up against the wall like evidence. What she'd come out of the other side of was harder to name, something like understanding without excusing, like seeing clearly without needing anything to be different. They were who they were. She was who she was becoming. And in the spring of the 5th year, Constance called her about a charity gala in Manhattan. "It's the Remington Foundation," Constance said. "They're doing an art auction for their arts education initiative, major collectors. Your work has been circulating in exactly these circles for the last 18 months. This would be a significant introduction." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "Constance," she said, "who chairs the Remington Foundation?" There was a brief pause. "The Cross Family Foundation has a seat on the board," Constance said carefully. "Damien Cross and his wife co-chair the gala." Another silence. "I know about your history," Constance said. "I looked into it before I called you. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, but I also want you to understand that your work belongs in that room, Vanessa, and nobody gets to take that from you." Vanessa looked at the paintings stacked around her studio. 5 years of them. 5 years of early mornings and late nights, and the slow, difficult work of becoming someone she hadn't been sure she was capable of being. 5 years of building something entirely her own from the raw material of everything that had been taken from her, or that she had let be taken, which was sometimes the same thing. "Tell me about the installation," she said. "What did you have in mind?" Constance Hayward Penn was not a woman who made phone calls she hadn't already thought through completely. Vanessa had learned this in the months since they'd formalized their working relationship. Constance operated like a chess player who'd already mapped out 6 moves before she opened her mouth. And when she presented something as a possibility, she'd usually already determined it was an inevitability. So when she called a second time, 3 days after the initial conversation about the Remington Gala, Vanessa knew she wasn't calling to check in. "I want to talk about the installation concept," Constance said. "I have some thoughts." "You have a plan." "I have a strong suggestion that I'm framing as thoughts out of courtesy." Vanessa set down her brush. She was working on a large piece, 4 feet by 6, layers of deep ochre and cracked gray with a vein of something close to gold running through the lower third. It wasn't finished, but it had reached that stage where a painting starts to have its own gravity, where you can feel it pulling toward what it wants to be. She didn't like leaving it mid-session, but Constance's calls tended to require full attention. "Go ahead," she said. "I don't want to send them a single canvas. I want to send them something they can't look away from. I'm thinking an immersive installation, floor to ceiling, multiple panels, ambient sound, something that fills the room and makes the room feel different once you're inside it." That's a significant undertaking for a gala auction. It is. But you have the catalog of work to build it from, and I have a venue contact at the Remington who owes me considerably more than a favor. And frankly, Vanessa, a canvas sells to one person. An installation becomes a conversation. That's what we need right now. Vanessa was quiet for a moment, looking at the gold vein running through the painting on her studio floor. "What's the theme?" "That's entirely yours. I don't touch the creative. You touch everything else." "Aggressively," Constance agreed. "But not the creative." Vanessa thought about what she'd been making for 5 years. She thought about what the work was actually about, underneath all the formal decisions and the critical language that got applied to it. It was about fracture and persistence, about what stays beautiful after it's been broken, about the specific kind of strength that doesn't look like strength because it's been through too much to bother performing. "I know what I want to do," she said. "Tell me." "Not yet. Let me build it first. Then I'll tell you." Constance accepted this without argument, which was its own form of respect. The installation took 11 weeks. Vanessa worked on it in stages. The studio reorganized to accommodate scale. 8 panels, each roughly 4 feet wide and 8 feet tall, designed to be arranged in a loose horseshoe configuration so that a viewer standing at the center would be surrounded. She called it reclamation, and the panels traced an arc. Not a linear narrative exactly, but something you could feel moving if you stood with it long enough. The earliest panels were dense and dark, built up in layers so thick you could see the paint cracking along its own fault lines. As the arc progressed, the palette shifted. Not to brightness, exactly, not to anything cheerful or resolved, but to a different quality of light, something harder earned. The final panel was the largest, 6 feet by 8, almost entirely made of textures rather than colors. A surface you wanted to press your hand against, if you could have, to understand what it was made of. Jonah helped her with the logistics, the crating, the technical specs the venue required, the ambient sound component, which was handled by a sound designer Constance brought in from Brooklyn. The sound was barely perceptible at normal gallery volume, low frequency, the kind of thing that registered in your chest before you noticed it with your ears. "It's uncomfortable," Jonah said the first time he stood inside the horseshoe configuration in the studio. "I mean that as a compliment. It makes you feel like the room is breathing." "That's what I want," Vanessa said. "I want people to feel like they walked into something alive." "You're going to blow that room apart." She looked at the 8 panels surrounding him, at the arc of broken and reconstructed surfaces, at 5 years of nights and difficult mornings compressed into 96 square feet of paint and intention. "I'm not trying to blow anything apart," she said. "I'm just trying to be accurate." She flew to New York on a Thursday, 2 days before the gala. The city hit her the way it always did when she returned. A physical thing, the density of it, the scale, the sound that wasn't quite like any other sound in the world. She'd been back twice since leaving, both times brief and functional, and both times she'd felt the particular sensation of moving through a place where a previous version of you still lived in all the corners. The woman who had pressed her forehead to cold glass on winter mornings and felt like she was floating. The woman who had carried a card with a dried leaf on it for 40 minutes before asking a question she already knew the answer to. She'd booked a hotel in the West 50s, not close to the Upper East Side where the penthouse was. Not because she was afraid of proximity, but because she had no interest in proximity. She was here to show her work. Everything else was geography. Petra met her for dinner Thursday night at a Thai place in Hell's Kitchen that they'd discovered together 20 years ago when they were both broke graduate students, and the portions were enormous relative to the prices. It was still there. Still the same green awning, same ceramic elephant by the door, different staff, but the same recipes. Petra looked almost exactly like herself, which was something Vanessa had always admired about her. She seemed constitutionally resistant to the ambient pressure to look like something other than what she was. Her hair was more gray than brown now, cut short, and she'd gained a little weight in the years since they'd drifted and reconnected, and she seemed genuinely comfortable in her skin in a way that Vanessa was still working toward, but could at least see clearly from where she was standing. They ordered too much food and ate it at the pace of people who have a lot of catching up to do and no intention of rushing. "Are you nervous?" Petra asked, over the remains of a shared green papaya salad. "About the show?" "About being in that room." His room. Vanessa considered the question. "Not the way you'd think. I'm not worried about seeing him. I've thought about it enough that it's lost most of the charge." "Most?" "I'm not going to pretend it's nothing, but it's also not... I don't know how to explain this. It stopped being about him a long time ago. The work isn't about him. It's about what I became after. He's just the circumstance." Petra looked at her for a moment. "That is either very healthy or extremely rehearsed." Vanessa laughed. "A real one, not a polished thing." "Probably both. That's kind of how therapy works." "You started therapy?" 2 years ago. A woman in Providence named Dr. Mackey, who has zero tolerance for self-pity and a remarkable ability to find the exact nerve you've been trying to avoid. Is it helping? It's clarifying, which sometimes feels worse before it feels better. She moved a piece of mango around her plate. "I spent a long time believing the story he told about me, that I was fragile, that my work was a hobby, that needing things, basic things, connection to be seen, was pathetic. That's the word he used, actually. Pathetic. And here's the embarrassing part. I knew it wasn't true, but I still absorbed it. It still got into the operating system somehow. That's not embarrassing. That's what sustained exposure to someone like that does. I know it intellectually now. The work has been unlearning it in the body, if that makes sense. Petra nodded slowly. And when you walk into that gala on Saturday? When I walk into that gala on Saturday, Vanessa said, I'll be there because my work belongs there. That's the whole story. The Remington Foundation Gala was held in a converted warehouse space in Tribeca that had been reimagined so thoroughly you had to look at the bones of the building, the old iron columns, the industrial windows, to remember what it had been. The renovation was the expensive kind that makes a place look effortless, all clean lines and warm lighting, and the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly groceries. Vanessa's installation occupied an alcove space off the main ballroom, separated by a partial wall that created the sense of a room within a room. Constance had been very specific in her negotiations about placement and lighting. 4 days of back and forth with the Remington's event director that Vanessa had stayed entirely out of and been quietly grateful for. When she arrived Friday morning for the install, the space was exactly what she needed: high ceilings, controlled lighting on dimmer tracks, enough separation from the main floor that the sound component wouldn't bleed into cocktail chatter, but close enough that people would wander in naturally. Jonah had flown down separately with the crates. They spent most of Friday setting up, adjusting panel positions by small degrees, arguing mildly about the angle of one piece in a way that was entirely professional, and also the way they usually worked. Jonah pushing for clarity, Vanessa trusting the ambiguity, both of them right in different ways. By Friday evening, when the light in the venue dropped to the pre-event setting and the installation was complete, Vanessa stood at the entrance to the horseshoe configuration and looked at what she'd built. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she'd ever made. Not the most technically accomplished. Her understanding of materials had refined considerably in 5 years, and there were individual paintings she'd done in the last 18 months that were more precise. But this was different. This was the whole arc at once, the full geography of what she'd been through, compressed and transformed into something that didn't announce its pain but carried it unmistakably underneath. Jonah stood beside her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." "It's a lot, seeing it all together like this." "It is." She looked at the final panel, the largest one, the one made entirely of texture. "But it's supposed to be a lot, that's the whole point." Saturday morning, she woke early in the hotel and went for a run along the river. The city was doing what it does in early June, warm and a little oversaturated with its own energy, everything at a slight pitch above comfortable. She ran 4 miles and came back and showered and ate breakfast at the hotel cafe and called Dr. Mackey, who she checked in with occasionally before significant things. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Mackey asked. "Present," Vanessa said. "Which is new. Usually before something big, I'm either ahead of it or behind it. Today I feel like I'm actually in the right moment." "What does that feel like in the body?" Vanessa thought about it. "Like the ground is solid. Like I know where my feet are." "Good. Hold on to that. There's still the part where I might see him." "There is. And his wife." "Also, yes." "Any words of wisdom?" "Doctor." Mackey was quiet for a moment in the specific way she had, that was never empty. Always thinking, always precise. "The thing you've spent 5 years building doesn't change based on what happens tonight. That's already yours. Whatever he does or doesn't do, whatever she says, whatever the room looks like, none of that touches what you made." "I know." "Then you already have the wisdom. You just needed to hear it back." She got dressed at 6. The gown was emerald silk, sleeveless, structured at the shoulders and fluid from the waist down. Constance had opinions about this and had expressed them with considerable force over a video call 3 weeks prior. Vanessa had listened to all of them and then made her own decision, which was how she approached most things now. The color was her choice. Deep, saturated green, something close to the color that appears in still water just before dark. It made her look, Petra had said when she saw a photograph, like someone who had decided. She had decided. Petra was meeting her in the lobby at 7. Constance would be at the venue already, had been there since 4 in the afternoon, managing 17 things simultaneously. Vanessa put on earrings her grandmother had left her. Simple gold drops, small and old and exactly right, and looked at herself in the hotel mirror for a moment. She wasn't the woman she'd been in that penthouse. She was also not the woman she'd been in Earl's rented room with the mustard-colored walls, carrying the weight of the first hard winter. She was something that had come through both of those and was still in the process of becoming, the way things always are when they're real and alive and not finished. But she was standing on her own ground. Her feet were where she'd placed them. She picked up her small clutch and went downstairs. The venue was already loud with the particular frequency of a room full of people who are powerful and know it and enjoy the company of others who are the same. Chandeliers threw honeyed light across 300 guests in their best versions of themselves. The women in gowns of black and cream and jewel tones. The men in the kind of tuxedos that cost what some people make in a month. Waitstaff moved through the room with the professional fluidity of people who have learned to be invisible to the people they serve. Vanessa had been in these rooms before. For years, she had been in exactly these rooms, at Damien's side, performing the role of the CEO's wife with what she now recognized as a kind of desperate competence, remembering everyone's names, navigating the social topography with precision, laughing at the right moments, and being quiet at the right moments, and never taking up more space than was allocated to her. She had been very good at it. It had cost her something she hadn't fully understood she was paying at the time. Now she walked into the same kind of room with Petra on one side, and Constance meeting her at the door on the other, and the difference was not something she could have explained in a sentence, but that she felt in the way she moved, in the way she held her shoulders, in the simple fact that she was here for a reason that belonged entirely to her. Constance took her arm lightly. The installation is already drawing attention. 3 people asked the event director about the artist before the doors even opened. 2 of them are serious collectors. Which 2? Elaine Chu and Marcus Webb. Do you know them? I know Marcus's foundation. He's bought work from artists I respect. He asked specifically about you, said a friend in Providence had been talking about your work for a year, and he'd missed seeing it in person. Constance's expression was as close to pleased as she ever got, which looked on her like a slight readjustment of certainty. Tonight is going to be important. Move through the room, let yourself be seen, and trust that the work does the rest. Has Damien arrived? She asked it the way you ask about weather, as information, not as fear. Constance glanced toward the far end of the room. About 20 minutes ago. He and his wife are near the auction display. So Vanessa followed the direction of the glance, without quite looking directly. Okay, she said. Good to know. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She'd stopped drinking at events, had found that clarity was more useful to her than the soft edges alcohol provided, and let Constance steer her toward the first group of collectors. For the first hour, it was the work. Only the work. Marcus Webb turned out to be a compact, attentive man in his 60s with a firm handshake and eyes that moved the way intelligent eyes do, quickly, noting everything, giving nothing away until he was ready. He'd spent 15 minutes alone in the installation before finding Vanessa at the edge of the ballroom, and when he introduced himself, he got directly to the point. Tell me about reclamation, he said. Not tell me about your career or your process or your influences. Tell me about this specific thing. What do you want to know? What the last panel is made of. I kept wanting to touch it. Vanessa smiled. Not a performance smile, but an actual one, the kind that starts somewhere in the chest. Encaustic wax over multiple layers of acrylic and found material, fabric mostly, some paper, things with histories. Things with histories, he repeated, turning the phrase over. Whose histories? She thought about how to answer. Mine, originally. But the thing about material with a history is that once you transform it into something new, it doesn't belong only to its origin story anymore. It belongs to whoever stands in front of it and brings their own. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to make an offer for the installation. Full purchase, once the auction is concluded. The auction is the means of sale tonight. I know. I'll outbid whatever comes up. He said it without any particular arrogance, just precision. I want to be direct with you. Work like this doesn't come through rooms like this very often. I don't like letting it pass. Constance materialized at Vanessa's elbow with the particular instinct she had for arriving exactly when she was needed. Vanessa caught her eye and knew she'd heard. "We'll talk," Vanessa said to Marcus. "Tonight or after?" He nodded, satisfied. "Tonight's better. I leave for Zurich Monday." As he moved away, Constance leaned in and said quietly, "That's the fastest he's moved on anything in the 3 years I've known him." "Is that good?" "It means the work said something to him that bypassed his usual caution. Yes, that's good." She was talking to Elaine Chu near the center of the room when she felt it. Not quite a sound and not quite a sensation, more like a change in atmospheric pressure, the way a room shifts when a specific person enters the space you're occupying. She'd felt it before, across 9 years of marriage, a kind of alertness. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her sentence to Elaine about a sculptor she admired who worked in salvaged industrial metal, and she listened to Elaine's response, and she kept her attention exactly where it was for the 30 seconds she needed to settle something in herself. Then she looked. Damien Cross looked the same, the way expensive machines look the same, maintained, polished, operating at the specifications that represented his best version of himself. He was 51 now, and it showed around the eyes but not unattractively, and he was dressed in a tuxedo that had been made specifically for him, and he moved through the room with the absolute ease of a man who had never been in a space that didn't accommodate him. Sabrina was beside him in a white gown with architectural shoulders, her hair swept up, one hand resting in the crook of his arm with the practiced ease of a woman who has learned exactly how to exist beside this particular man. She was beautiful in the way Vanessa had always acknowledged, specific and well-engineered and projecting something that read as warmth from across a room, but that Vanessa, the few times she'd been close enough to actually look, recognized as its professional imitation. They were heading, she realized, toward the installation. She watched them disappear around the partial wall and felt something move through her that was harder to categorize than either fear or satisfaction. It was more like witnessing, like standing at a distance from something significant and understanding that you are present for it without being controlled by it. Elaine was saying something about her collector's trip to Berlin. Vanessa brought herself back with a small internal effort and asked a follow-up question, and the conversation continued, and she was in it while also being separately, quietly aware of the horseshoe of panels in the next room and the man currently standing inside them. 4 minutes passed. Maybe 5. Damien came back out first. His face was doing something complicated. The careful blankness of a man who has been hit by something he didn't expect and is deciding how to manage the impact. Sabrina came out behind him, one hand touching the pearl at her throat, looking at the room around her with the slightly unfocused expression of someone who has just absorbed something they're not ready to feel. Neither of them looked toward Vanessa. Vanessa watched them for exactly as long as it took to understand what she'd seen in Damien's face. Then she turned back to Elaine and said, "Tell me more about the Berlin trip. Were you there for the fair?" She did not look back again. But she felt, in a place that was deeper than thought, that something had already begun. At 9 o'clock, the event director, a brisk woman named Claudette, who wore her efficiency like a second outfit, moved through the room gathering the key exhibiting artists for a brief introduction before the live auction began. There were 4 artists total. Vanessa was last. She stood at the edge of the small staging area while Claudette ran through the format, and she was aware of the room rearranging itself around the event. Guests moving toward the central space, conversations tapering, that specific quality of attention that a large room develops when it decides something is about to matter. She was also aware, with the peripheral precision of someone who has done their emotional preparation, of exactly where Damien was standing. To her left and back, near the 3rd row of the gathered audience, beside Sabrina and a man she recognized as one of his senior executives. He had a drink in his hand that he hadn't touched in several minutes. She looked straight ahead. The first artist was introduced. The second. The third. Then Claudette's voice, clear and carrying, and finally, the creator of the installation reclamation, which many of you have already experienced this evening, Vanessa Hale. The applause was real. Not the automatic variety, the kind that builds for a moment as the room decides how it feels, and then commits. She stepped forward and thanked the foundation, said a few sentences about the installation that were true and specific and not the least bit rehearsed sounding because she'd refused to write anything down. And she mentioned the title and the concept in terms simple enough to carry across a room full of people who weren't all primarily invested in the language of contemporary art. She did not look at Damien Cross while she spoke, but she knew, with the clarity of someone who has learned to read silences, that he was looking at her, with the particular quality of attention that belongs to a person who is trying to locate something they've lost the coordinates for. She kept her eyes on the room. She finished speaking, and the applause rose again, and she stepped back and she breathed. The auction was about to begin. And somewhere to her left, in the second row of the gathered crowd, a man was holding an untouched drink and beginning very slowly to understand. The auctioneer was a man named Gerald Foss, who did this for a living and was very good at it. The particular combination of authority and theatrical ease that keeps a room engaged through price increments and strategic pauses. He worked through the first three pieces at a pace that suggested confidence, and the room responded the way rooms full of wealthy people respond when they've already had 2 drinks and the lighting is flattering and the cause is something they can feel good about supporting. Bids came quickly. Numbers climbed. Applause punctuated each hammerfall with the specific enthusiasm of people who like watching money move. Vanessa stood near the back of the gathered crowd with Constance slightly behind her and Petra to her left. She kept her breathing even. She'd been to enough of these to know that the mechanics of an auction are designed to create pressure, to make the room feel like something is about to be lost, and she'd made a decision before the evening started that she wasn't going to let the mechanics of anything run her tonight. Gerald Foss introduced reclamation with the kind of language that told her he'd been briefed by Constance. Accurate without being overwrought, specific enough to be respectful. He mentioned the installation's 8 panels, the ambient sound component, the arc from fracture to something harder to name. He said, a work that doesn't ask you to feel a particular thing, but makes it very difficult not to feel something. Which was, Vanessa thought, probably the best single sentence anyone had said about it. The opening bid was set at $80,000. It cleared inside 10 seconds. The room had a different quality now. She could feel it, the shift from appreciative attention to something more competitive and alive. Numbers moved in $20,000 increments. A woman in the third row whom Vanessa didn't recognize. A man near the left wall bidding by tablet. Marcus Webb, standing at the right edge of the crowd, with his paddle raised at a precise angle that communicated he was in no particular hurry and intended to win. 140. 160. 180. The woman in the third row dropped out at 200,000. The man with the tablet followed at 220. It narrowed to Marcus and a second bidder she couldn't place, a tall man near the center whose paddle went up with the careful regularity of someone who had decided on a ceiling and was approaching it. 260. 280. $300,000. The tall man paused. His paddle went down. He leaned toward the woman beside him and said something. His ceiling, apparently. Marcus raised his paddle. 320. Foss acknowledged it, paused. Did the theatrical survey of the room. Do I have 340? The room held. And then, from the left side of the audience, a voice, unhurried, carrying, accustomed to being heard in rooms like this. 500,000. The room reacted the way rooms react to an unexpected number, a collective intake, a moment of recalibration, heads turning. Gerald Foss looked briefly surprised before his professional training smoothed it over. $500,000, a new bid from Mr. Cross. Thank you. He said the name with the slight amplification of a man who knows the name will land. It landed. The murmur that moved through the room had multiple layers in it. This was the co-chair of the gala bidding on an auction item at his own event, at a number that nearly doubled the previous high. It was the kind of move that was either generosity or theater, and everyone in the room was doing the math on which. Vanessa did not move. She was aware of Petra going very still beside her. She was aware of Constance's hand touching her elbow. Not steering, just present. She kept her eyes on Gerald Foss and kept her breathing where it was. $500,000, Foss repeated, with the slightly grander diction the number warranted. Do I have 520? Marcus Webb's paddle stayed down. He looked across the crowd toward Vanessa, and something in his expression was careful and specific. Not retreat, just acknowledgement that the parameters of the room had changed. Going once at 500,000. Foss paused. The theatrical pause extended. Going twice. Vanessa looked at Constance. One look. Constance's eyes went sharp and she gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod that said, "Your call, entirely." "Sold," said Foss, and the hammer came down, and the room applauded with the enthusiasm of people who had just watched something interesting happen and weren't entirely sure what it was. The applause was still moving through the room when she felt rather than saw the approach. That same atmospheric shift she'd noticed earlier. The pressure change that preceded Damien Cross entering your immediate space. She turned before he was close enough for it to be unavoidable, which gave her the advantage of composure, and she watched him cross the last 15 feet between them with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before he can think better of it. He was smiling. The specific smile she recognized from 100 events across their marriage. Open, warm, calibrated for public spaces and new acquaintances. The smile that was almost real. "Extraordinary work," he said. He stopped at a polite distance, extending a hand. "Damien Cross, I co-chair the Remington Foundation." Vanessa looked at the extended hand, then at his face. He had not recognized her yet. The understanding of this arrived in her the way something enormous sometimes does. Quietly, without fanfare. Its weight becoming apparent only once it had already settled. She looked at the face of a man who had been married to her for 9 years, who had looked at her across breakfast tables and boardroom events, and the hollow silence of too many evenings to count. And he was looking at her right now with the pleasant, faintly assessing expression of someone meeting a successful stranger. She shook his hand. "Vanessa Hale," she said. Nothing, no flicker of it. He was nodding, the handshake still warm, moving immediately into the next sentence. "The installation is remarkable. I've been to a lot of these events, and I don't say that about everything." A small, self-deprecating laugh, the kind that wealthy men deploy to seem approachable. "The way the panels are arranged, you feel like the room changes around you. My wife and I were talking about it." "That was the intention," she said. "Where are you based?" "Massachusetts, a town called Harlow." "I don't know it." "Most people don't." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man who finds something mildly interesting. "Self-taught, or RISD, she said. "A long time ago." "Right. And your gallery representation?" "Constance Hayward Penn." "Constance is brilliant." He said it with the ease of someone who'd been in enough rooms with Constance to have formed an opinion, and the ease of it made something in Vanessa's chest move in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not grief exactly, but the specific ache of watching a person be entirely, comfortably themselves in total ignorance of what they're standing in the middle of. "She has an exceptional eye." "She does," Vanessa said. The $500,000 sat between them in the conversation like an object neither of them had yet acknowledged. He would bring it up. She waited. "I hope you'll consider the acquisition," he said. "My foundation has a significant arts program and a collection that I think, honestly, would be a meaningful home for work of this caliber." There it was. She'd understood the bid before he placed it, had felt the shape of the gesture the moment his voice rose in the auction room. Not purely philanthropic, not purely competitive, but something that was both and also something else. A man reaching for something he'd recognized in the installation without knowing what he recognized or why. "Thank you," she said. She kept her voice exactly level. "I'm in several conversations about the installation." He nodded, accepting this as negotiation rather than refusal. He was very good in these interactions, fluid and confident and entirely in his element. She watched him from the distance she'd built over 5 years, and she thought, he is exactly who he always was. The version of himself he'd shown her across 9 years of marriage hadn't been a performance. It had been genuine. The problem had never been that he was hiding something. The problem had been what was genuinely, authentically there. And the larger problem had been that she'd spent 9 years trying to find, beneath the surface of it, something more. There wasn't more. This was the whole of it. And standing across from him now, she found that understanding almost comfortable. Like a diagnosis you've already adjusted your life around. "I should let you get back to your guests," she said. "Of course." He smiled again. Truly, wonderful work. Vanessa Hale, I'll remember the name. She watched him turn and move back toward the center of the room, back toward Sabrina, who was waiting with 2 glasses of wine and a questioning look, and she stood exactly where she was for a moment and let the full absurdity of it move through her. 9 years. A card with a dried leaf on the front. I still choose you. Do you still choose me? The penthouse windows and the clanging radiator and 4 miles every morning and 11 weeks of building reclamation and the whole impossible, exhausting, necessary arc of becoming. And he'd shaken her hand and said he'd remember the name. Petra appeared at her side. I watched the whole thing, she said, her voice low and very controlled. He didn't know. No. Vanessa, I know. How are you, Sal? I'm fine, she paused. I'm genuinely fine, Petra. I need you to believe me when I say that. Petra looked at her for a long moment. I believe you, she said, but I also reserve the right to be furious on your behalf. Granted, Vanessa said, and despite everything, the whole enormous, complicated weight of the last 12 minutes, she felt something in her chest that was recognizably related to laughter. Constance found her 20 minutes later near the installation entrance, where a small cluster of guests had gathered to look again after the auction. There was something satisfying about that. The way the bidding had amplified the work's presence in the room made people reconsider it, go back. Marcus wants to talk, Constance said. He's not walking away from the acquisition conversation just because Cross made a play. Well, what does that conversation look like? He wants the full installation, permanent placement in the Webb Foundation's gallery in Chicago. He mentioned commissioning a second large-scale piece for their new wing. They're opening in 18 months. Vanessa let that settle. Chicago. It's a significant platform. The foundation gets serious international attention. I know what the Webb Foundation is, Constance. Of course you do. Constance's tone adjusted slightly. She had the ability to hear when she was being too transactional and to recalibrate without making it a production. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Marcus bought work because the work spoke to him, which is the reason I want work to be bought. She looked at the installation, at the panels visible through the entrance, the horseshoe of broken and reconstructed surfaces. I'm thinking the installation should go somewhere it'll be seen by people who need to see it, not added to a private foundation's prestige inventory. The Webb Foundation has a public gallery. Then let's talk to Marcus. She found him near the bar, in conversation with a woman she recognized as a curator from the Whitney. He extracted himself with the smooth ease of someone practiced at managing multiple conversations at a gala, and they found a quiet corner near the venue's east wall where the sound level dropped enough for a real exchange. You handled the cross-bid well, Marcus said, without preamble. I didn't handle anything. I just stood there. That's what I mean. His eyes were direct and without artifice. A lot of artists in that position would have done something with their face. You didn't. I've had practice standing in rooms where other people are making decisions about me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more a recognition. He looked at her the way she'd noticed certain people look at the paintings, not admiring the surface, but trying to see what the surface was made of. The Chicago offer is real, he said. Permanent placement, full installation, proper attribution, and featured positioning in the new wing. And yes, the commission conversation, but that's entirely on your terms and your timeline. No pressure, architecture. No pressure architecture, she repeated. I've made the mistake before of pushing artists before they were ready. The work gets made, but it's not what it would have been. I'd rather wait. She looked at him for a moment. What made you want to buy it, specifically? He thought about the question with a seriousness she appreciated. The last panel, he said. I stood in front of it for a long time. There's something in the texture, the way the layers are compressed, all that history underneath, that reads like survival without triumph. Most work about resilience tilts toward triumph. It's more comfortable. Your final panel doesn't do that. It just says, this is what endurance actually feels like, which is much harder to make and much truer. Vanessa was quiet, something the painter in her recognized. The particular sensation of someone accurately describing what you were trying to do, which was rarer than it should have been. Okay, she said. Chicago. Marcus extended his hand. I'll have my team contact Constance on Monday. Good. He paused before moving away. One more thing, completely outside the professional conversation. He glanced briefly toward the part of the room where Damian Cross was standing with a group of business associates, holding a glass, laughing at something. Then he looked back at Vanessa. I know who he is. I know enough to have connected some things tonight. I want you to know, just so it's been said, that what you made is entirely yours. Whatever it came from, it belongs to you now. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. I've known that for a while. He nodded once and moved away, and she stood in the corner for a moment alone, which she needed. The recognition came, in the end, not from a grand revelation, but from something small and accidental, the way things that have been avoided too long tend to finally arrive. It was just past 10. The formal program had ended and the room had relaxed into the later, looser phase of a gala. Smaller clusters, louder conversation, the bars doing steadier business. Vanessa had spent 40 minutes in productive conversation with two other collectors Constance steered toward her, and she was genuinely engaged. The kind of conversation about work and intention and the relationship between the two that she could sustain for hours without fatigue because it was the actual substance of her life. She was reaching for a glass of water from a passing tray when she turned and nearly walked directly into Sabrina Vale. They were close enough that avoidance wasn't possible. Sabrina's reaction was instantaneous and involuntary. The slight widening of recognition, then the rapid recalibration behind her eyes as she processed what she was looking at and arrived at the decision about how to handle it. Vanessa watched it happen across her face in approximately 2 seconds. Vanessa, Sabrina said. The voice was careful, smooth. Sabrina. A moment of extraordinarily calibrated silence. I didn't know you'd be here tonight, Sabrina said. I'm here with my work. Of course. Something moved across Sabrina's expression. Not quite discomfort, more like the face of someone who is running simultaneous calculations. The installation is beautiful, genuinely. Thank you. When did you start painting again? The question was so specifically constructed, again as though painting were a hobby Vanessa had put down and picked back up, as though the 5 years of work weren't a body of practice, but a recreational resumption, that Vanessa felt the shape of it clearly. She took a small breath. I never stopped, she said. I was in a situation that made it difficult for a while. Then I wasn't in that situation anymore. The silence that followed was thin and precise as a blade. Sabrina's hand moved to her pearls again, the same gesture Vanessa had noticed when she came out of the installation earlier. A tell. You look well, Sabrina said, which was the kind of thing you say when you've run out of the alternative. I am well, Vanessa said. She kept her voice entirely neutral, not warm, not cold, simply factual. Thank you for saying so. She excused herself with a brief nod and moved away before it could become anything else. And she kept moving until she was near the installation entrance again, the panels visible through the opening, the space she'd built still doing exactly what she'd built it to do. She was standing there, breathing steadily, when Damian found her. He came from the right, and this time his movement was different. Not the social approach of a co-chair working his room, but the kind of movement that has something urgent underneath it. She heard his footsteps and turned and watched his face as he covered the last 20 feet between them. He'd been looking at her all night, she understood. Looking and not looking, looking away and returning, some part of him unable to settle. And something, Sabrina's expression when she came back from their conversation, or a word passed, or simply the accumulated weight of looking at something that kept insisting on being recognized, had finally reached him. He stopped about 6 feet from her, closer than social distance, not close enough for intimacy. He looked at her face, really looked at it. The way she'd asked him to look at her for years, in the last years of their marriage, the way he'd stopped being able to do and she'd stopped being able to ask for. He looked at her with the particular quality of someone who has just understood something that had been right in front of them, and the understanding is so much worse than the not knowing that for a moment you wish you could go back. Vanessa, he said, not the smooth introduction of an hour ago. Just her name, stripped of everything else. Damian, she said. He stood very still. She watched something move through him, not one emotion but a cascade of them, one displacing the next too fast for any to settle. Disbelief. recognition. Something she might have called shame if she'd thought him capable of it in any uncomplicated form, but which was probably more like its precursor, the raw material before it's been processed into the version you can live with. You... He stopped, started again. That's your work? Yes. All of it. The installation? Yes. He looked at the entrance to the horseshoe configuration and back at her face, and she could see him trying to assemble what he was looking at, the woman standing in front of him with Marcus Webb's promise in her recent conversation, and Constance Hayward Penn's representation and 5 years of work behind her, with the woman he'd last seen picking up a suitcase in a penthouse on Park Avenue on a night he'd come home to find her gone. The math of what it would have taken, the distance between those two versions. I didn't, he started. Recognize me, she said. She kept her voice steady and clear and without anything in it that could be mistaken for an invitation. I know. He had the grace not to try to explain that. Instead, he stood there with the expression of a man doing a very specific kind of reckoning, the kind where you look at what's in front of you and you understand, with the clarity that only arrives too late, the actual value of what you had and what you chose to do with it. How long have you been... He gestured toward the space around them, the gala, the installation, the room full of people who knew her name tonight. Building toward this? 5 years. Since the month I left. Harlow, Massachusetts, he said, the information from their earlier conversation now landing differently. She watched him absorb the particular humiliation of having had a pleasant introductory conversation with his ex-wife without knowing it. I asked where you were from. You did. And you told me. I told you, she said. You just didn't know who you were asking. He was quiet for a long moment. Behind him, the party continued. 100 conversations, the clink of glassware, a burst of laughter from somewhere near the bar. The room entirely unconcerned with the specific gravity of what was happening in this small square of parquet floor. Vanessa? He said it differently than he'd said it in that bathroom mirror 10 years ago. The same name, but with weight in it now, weight that had arrived too late to do what weight is supposed to do when it arrives on time. What you've made is mine, she said. Completely mine. Something crossed his face at that, an acknowledgement. I know. Do you? He looked at the installation entrance again, at the panels visible through the gap, the final large panel just visible at the far end. He'd stood in there earlier tonight without knowing who had built it, and whatever it had done to him, whatever a person feels when they walk through the documented interior life of someone they unmade and abandoned, he was carrying it now, and it showed in the particular stillness of how he was standing, like a man who has had something taken out of him. I tried to buy it, he said. I know. $500,000. I know what you bid, Damien. Was that... He searched for the word. Was that too much? Was it the amount? Because it has nothing to do with the amount. The clarity of it stopped him. He waited. She looked at him directly, the way she'd wanted to look at him for years and hadn't known how. Not angry, not wounded, not performing any version of the woman he might have expected to see standing across from him at a charity gala 5 years after the end of their marriage. Just clear. Just present. I'm not selling reclamation to you, she said. Not for 500,000. Not for 5 million, not for any number. Because of what happened between us. Because the work isn't for you. It was never for you. She held his gaze. The work is for the people who look at it and recognize something in it that belongs to their own experience. And I've already had that conversation tonight with someone who's going to give it a home where that can keep happening. He absorbed this. Marcus Webb, he said. Yes. Something shifted in his expression. The particular face of a man accustomed to winning financial negotiations encountering the specific ceiling of a decision that has nothing to do with money. It didn't fit his features well. She could see him trying to find the angle, the variable he could adjust, the leverage point he was missing. I was wrong, he said. The words came out rough, like something he'd had to clear out of the way to get to. In the marriage. I know that. I've known it for... I know. Okay, she said. That's it? Okay. What would you like me to say? I don't know. He was uncomfortable now in a way she hadn't seen on him before. Damian Cross was very rarely at a loss for the next move, and she could see the discomfort of that vacancy in him, the blankness where the strategy usually lived. I spent a lot of tonight looking at your work, not knowing it was yours, and I felt, what did you feel? He was quiet for a moment, like I was looking at something I understood but couldn't quite locate, like it was familiar in a way I couldn't explain. A pause. And then Sabrina came back and she told me, and I went back into the installation, Vanessa said. I saw you. He'd gone back in after speaking with Sabrina. She'd watched from the ballroom, a distant observation she'd filed away and not engaged with emotionally. He'd stood in there for 9 minutes. She knew because she'd watched Jonah watching from the side, and Jonah had looked at her with a question on his face, and she'd given him a small shake of her head. Yes, he said. I went back in. And? He looked at the entrance to the installation, then back at her, and she saw something in his face that was perhaps the truest thing she'd ever seen on him. Not the polished warmth, and not the impatient dismissal, and not the social competence, but something rawer than all of those, something that was costing him to let sit on the surface of his face in a room full of people. Regret, maybe. The specific, solid kind. Not the version that asked for something in return. I stood in front of the last panel for a long time, he said, and I thought about how something becomes what it's made of. How the history is in the material. He paused. I thought about what I put into you, what I made of you, and then I thought about what you made of what I made of you, and I... He stopped. She waited. I don't have a way to finish that sentence that isn't insulting to what you've done, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Here was the man she'd spent 9 years beside. Here was the man who had said the word pathetic in a quiet voice in his own home, at a party where she was wearing a borrowed dress. Here was the man who had looked right through her until she left, and who was now, 5 years too late, looking at her with the full attention she'd spent the last decade of their shared life asking for and being denied. She did not feel triumph. She had thought about this moment, some version of it, enough times over 5 years that she'd worked through triumph and out the other side a long time ago. What she felt was something more complicated and more final. The particular piece of standing in a place you've earned and understanding that the person who couldn't see you then truly cannot change what you've become now. That the recognition, when it finally arrives, changes nothing about the work, changes nothing about who she is, changes nothing, actually, about anything that matters. It was done. It had been done for 5 years. She just needed to stand in the same room with it one more time to know that completely. I appreciate you saying that, she said. And she meant it. Not warmly, not coldly, just cleanly. As a true statement. I need to get back to my guests. Vanessa, Damian. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you have genuinely, fully released. Not with hostility, not with warmth, with a kind of neutral finality that is in its own way more complete than either. Good night. She turned and walked back into the room, toward the cluster of collectors near the installation entrance, toward Constance's efficient presence and Petra's steadiness and the sound of people talking about work she had built from the ground of herself. She did not look back. Behind her, she knew he was standing exactly where she'd left him, surrounded by the light and the noise of the event he co-chaired, in the room he'd helped fill, in the city that had always been more his than hers, holding a drink he'd probably stopped tasting an hour ago. And for the first time in 5 years, knowing exactly where he was behind her felt like nothing at all. Like geography. Like a distance she'd already crossed and had no reason to recross. The room opened up in front of her. Her work was on the wall. Her name was in the program. Marcus Webb was across the room with a handshake still warm from the agreement they'd made, and Constance was threading toward her through the crowd with the particular expression she wore when things were going exactly as planned. And Petra was near the bar making the face that meant she had commentary that could wait, but preferred not to. Vanessa walked toward all of it. She kept her shoulders level. She kept her chin up. She moved through the room the way she'd been practicing for 5 years, every morning on those 4 miles. Like someone who knows exactly where her feet are. Like someone who has decided, finally and without reservation, that the ground beneath her belongs to her because she built it herself. The evening was still going. There were still conversations to be had, Hands to shake, work to discuss. The whole necessary labor of being seen on her own terms in a room that had once only known her as someone else's. She had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to feel exactly this. Not the triumph of his recognition, not the satisfaction of his regret. Just this. The simple, solid fact of her own presence in her own life. The understanding that she had come through something enormous and built something real on the other side of it, and that nothing, not his money, not his recognition, not the way he'd looked at her in the end with the full attention she'd once needed so desperately, changed that by a single degree. The room was bright and full and loud with the sound of 300 lives happening simultaneously, and Vanessa Hale moved through the center of it with the quiet certainty of a woman who has absolutely nothing left to prove. The photographs appeared online before midnight. Someone at the gala, nobody ever determined exactly who, though Constance had her suspicions about a junior staffer from the event company who'd been working the room with a phone, had captured the moment Damien stood in front of Vanessa near the installation entrance. The angle was good, as these accidental photographs sometimes are, better than anything staged. Damien's back half to the camera, his posture carrying the specific quality of a man stripped of his usual ease, and Vanessa facing him with the particular composure that the photographer couldn't have understood the full weight of, but that the image communicated anyway. She looked, in the photograph, like someone who had already won a contest that the other person hadn't realized was happening. The caption that accompanied the first post, from a society blogger who covered Manhattan's cultural circuit with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who understood that the real story was never the charity, read, Remington Gala Drama. Billionaire Damien Cross spends the evening failing to recognize his own ex-wife, celebrated artist Vanessa Hale, whose installation he then tried to buy for $500,000. She declined. This is her face while declining. By morning, it had 40,000 shares. Vanessa found out at 7:15 when Petra texted her a link with the single message, brace yourself. She read the post in bed in the hotel, in the specific stillness of early morning when the city hadn't quite committed to full noise yet, and she sat with the information for a few minutes before deciding how she felt about it. The photograph was accurate, which was the thing she kept coming back to. It hadn't been manipulated or miscontextualized. It showed exactly what had happened. Whatever came from it was coming from the truth of the moment, and she had a harder time being upset about the truth of the moment than she might have expected. She called Constance. I've seen it, Constance said before Vanessa got a word out. I've been up since 5. My phone hasn't stopped. What kind of calls? 3 journalists wanting comment, 2 podcast producers, a television segment producer from a morning show I won't name, and 8 collectors who apparently saw the post and then looked up your work and want conversations. A pause. Also, Marcus Webb, confirming Monday's meeting and adding that the Chicago announcement will have considerably more press attention than he'd originally anticipated, which he seems to regard as a bonus. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. I don't want to be a story about him, she said. I don't want the work to become a footnote in a narrative about Damien Cross. I know. I've already drafted the statement. You don't comment on the personal history, you speak only to the work. You express appreciation for the Remington Foundation's support of arts education and let the work do the rest. The photograph does what the photograph does. We can't control that. What we can control is the frame. Send me the statement before you release it. Already in your email. She read it over coffee in the hotel cafe, made 2 small adjustments to the wording that brought it closer to her actual voice, and sent it back. Constance released it at 9. By noon, it had been quoted in 4 separate write-ups about the gala, 2 of which focused primarily on reclamation and Vanessa's 5-year trajectory, using the personal history as context rather than center. One of them, in a digital arts magazine with a serious readership, opened with a paragraph about the installation and spent 300 words on the work before mentioning Damien Cross at all, and when it did, it was in service of a sentence about what the work had been built from rather than who it was built against. That was the one Vanessa read twice. She flew back to Harlow on Sunday afternoon. The studio was exactly as she'd left it. The large ochre piece still propped against the north wall, Jonah's tidy handwriting on the inventory clipboard by the door, the smell of linseed oil and cold air, and the particular quiet of a space where work happens. She stood in it for a few minutes without doing anything, just letting the familiarity of it settle over her. This was the place she'd chosen. This was the life she'd built. The gala and the photograph and Damien's face in the moment of recognition, all of that was behind her now, in the city, and it would keep generating noise for however long the news cycle decided to sustain interest. But the studio was here. The work was here. The next piece was waiting on the wall with its ochre and gray, unfinished, asking for the hours she owed it. She changed out of her traveling clothes, put on the paint-stained jeans she worked in, and went back to the canvas. She worked until 8 that night, and it was good. The noise, as Constance had predicted, did not die quickly. The story had a shape that was difficult for the media to let go of. The wronged wife, the oblivious billionaire, the 5 years of quiet reconstruction, the public moment of reversal. It was a clean narrative with a clear emotional logic and a photograph that told most of it in a single frame. Various outlets handled it with various degrees of responsibility. The arts coverage was largely good, focused on the work, interested in the trajectory, treating Vanessa as the primary subject rather than a character in someone else's story. The general interest coverage was more mixed, a few pieces more interested in the drama than the art, though even those tended to quote her statement and include images of reclamation alongside the photograph. She did 2 interviews, both with print publications she respected, both conducted by journalists who had read her statement and agreed in advance to keep the conversation primarily on the work. Both, she felt, landed approximately where she wanted them. She declined everything else: the morning show, the podcast, the request from a documentary filmmaker who'd left 3 messages with Constance in 48 hours. She understood the appetite for the fuller story, but she also understood that the fuller story was hers, and that what she chose to share of it, and how, and when, was among the most important decisions she could make right now. Jonah handled the studio logistics while the volume of correspondence was at its peak, filtering inquiries, scheduling conversations Constance flagged as priority, keeping the physical space functional while Vanessa worked. He was 26 and deeply competent and had the particular quality of someone who understood, without being told, when to talk and when to be useful in silence. She'd been lucky to find him. She knew it. The Providence Gallery wants to do a retrospective, he told her one morning, setting a coffee on the edge of the work table. 12 to 15 pieces tracing the full 5 years. They're proposing February. February's too close. Tell them September. They'll push back. Tell them September and explain that the Chicago installation is going up in 18 months, and I need the retrospective to come after I've had time to contextualize the arc properly. If they're serious about the show, they'll wait. He wrote it down. Also, a gallery in London reached out, through Constance. They want to know if you'd consider international representation. She looked up from the canvas. London. Constance said to tell you she's not pushing in either direction. Entirely your call. She thought about it. Tell Constance I want to have a real conversation about it, not email. Have her call me Thursday. Got it. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing. I didn't know if you'd want to know, but there's been some coverage about Crosstech, not related to the gala story. A couple of business publications ran pieces about some investors pulling back from a round. Apparently the gala situation made some of his more conservative partners nervous. She set down the brush. What kind of nervous? The optics kind. Some older board members apparently don't love the public narrative. There's a profile piece in one of the financial magazines that describes him as, I'm reading directly here, a CEO whose personal conduct has begun generating the kind of press that makes institutional investors reconsider their comfort levels. She was quiet for a moment. She'd known, in some abstract way, that there might be professional fallout for Damien. The photograph had spread far enough and fast enough to reach circles that mattered to him. But knowing it abstractly and hearing the specific shape of it were different things. I didn't want that, she said. Not defensive, just accurate. Jonah looked at her. I know. The photograph wasn't my doing. The story wasn't something I engineered. I know that too. She picked the brush back up. I'm not going to pretend I feel terrible about it, but I didn't want it. She looked at the canvas. What I wanted was to show the work. That's still the only thing I wanted. He nodded and left her to it, and she returned to the ochre and gray, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when you're doing the work you're supposed to be doing. 3 weeks after the gala, On a Wednesday afternoon, when the light in the studio was the flat, useful kind that lets you see a surface clearly, Constance called. He reached out, she said. Vanessa knew who she meant. To you? To your studio contact email, which I monitor, as you know. He's asked to meet. He says he'd like to discuss acquiring work, not reclamation, something new, and that he understands the installation decision and respects it. He says he understands it. Those are his words. She set the palette knife down on the work table and looked at the painting. It was nearly finished now. 5 weeks of sessions. The gold vein fully resolved into the lower third, the upper register finding the color she'd been reaching for, something between storm and aftermath. She'd been thinking about calling it After the Weather. What do you think? She asked Constance. Honestly, I think he wants something that has nothing to do with art acquisition, and he's using the professional framing because he doesn't have another language for it. And from a career standpoint, selling work to Damien Cross right now would be complicated. Not impossible, but the optics have a quality that could read as reconciliation, and the current narrative, which is almost entirely favorable to you, would shift. So, your recommendation? I don't make recommendations about your personal life. You just did. A brief pause. I'm making a professional observation. The personal element is yours to navigate. Vanessa thought about it for a few seconds. Tell him I'll meet him, once, at the gallery in Harlow. Constance was quiet. Are you sure? I have things I want to say to him that I didn't say at the gala. I said what needed to be said in that room. But there are other things. Things that belong to the longer history, not the performance of one evening. And I'd rather say them in a space that's mine. She looked around the studio, the canvases, the shelves of materials, the high north windows. I'd rather say them here. When? When I'm ready. Tell him I'll be in touch. Quote. She thought about it for 2 weeks before she called. Not obsessively. She had too much work in front of her for obsession, and Dr. Mackey had been good at helping her understand the difference between processing and circling. She thought about it the way she thought about a difficult passage in a painting, returning to it at intervals, looking at it from different angles, understanding what it needed rather than imposing what she wanted. What it needed, she decided, was truth, not performance, not the version of strength that is really just pride, which she'd learned the difference from in those first months in Harlow. Just the thing that was actually true, said plainly, in a room she'd built herself. She called him on a Thursday morning. He answered on the second ring, which told her something about the state he'd been in. Thank you for calling, he said. He sounded like himself, but with something taken out. The particular ease that had always characterized how he occupied space, that was diminished. I'm not going to draw this out, she said. You can come to Harlow. I'll give you an hour, not as a collector, as someone I was married to. A pause. Okay. Next Friday, 2 o'clock. I'll be there. She gave him the studio address and got off the call before it could become something she hadn't intended. And she sat for a few minutes with the particular feeling of a decision made. Not good, not bad, just settled. He arrived in a car that was wrong for Harlow. Sleek and black and city expensive, conspicuous on Clement Street the way an expensive coat is conspicuous in a hardware store. She watched it pull up from the studio window. He got out alone, no assistant, no driver who waited in the car. He stood on the street for a moment, looking at the building with an expression she couldn't read at distance. And then he came up. She buzzed him in without speaking through the intercom. He came up the stairs and into the studio and stopped just inside the doorway. And she watched him take in the space, the scale of it, the paintings on the walls and floor, the materials on the work tables, the north light coming through the high windows in that flat, clear way that made everything in the room exactly what it was. She saw him see all of it. This is where you work, he said. Yes. He looked at the nearly finished canvas against the north wall. After the weather, almost done now, the gold vein settled, and the upper register exactly right. He looked at it for a long time. Can I? He gestured toward it. You can look. He walked to it and stood in front of it. She let him. She watched him the way she'd watched the schoolteacher Britt Hayward years ago stand in front of those first 12 paintings in Ray Bourdette's empty room. with the specific patience of someone who understands that a painting takes as long as it takes. He stood there for 4 minutes. She didn't time it. She estimated afterward. Then he turned around. "Sit down if you want," she said. There were 2 wooden chairs near the work table, the kind of utilitarian furniture that accumulates in working spaces. He pulled one out and sat. She remained standing, leaning against the table with her arms loosely crossed. Not defensive, just comfortable in her own space. "I've been trying to think about what to say," he started. "Then don't think about it," she said. "Just say what's true." He looked at his hands for a moment. They were the same hands. She remembered them, the way you remember specific physical details of people you spent years beside. The particular way he held a pen, the way he rubbed his thumb across his palm when he was thinking. He was doing that now. "I let you disappear," he said. "I watched it happen, and I told myself it wasn't happening, that you were fine, that you were just quiet that year. And the year before. I knew it wasn't fine, and I didn't—" He stopped. "I was in love with Sabrina, and I was too much of a coward to say that plainly to you. So instead, I just reduced me," she said, "until there wasn't enough of me left to make the confrontation necessary." He looked at her. The accuracy of it hit his face in a way she could see. "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly. She'd known this, had understood it in the way you understand things you've processed through years of work and therapy and middle-of-the-night honesty. But hearing it from him carried a different weight. Not healing, exactly. Just completion. Like the last stroke on a canvas that was already mostly done. "The word you used," she said, "on our anniversary, when I asked if we could leave early." He went still. "You said it was pathetic," she said. "That what I was feeling, wanting to be with my own husband on our anniversary, was pathetic." "I know. I carried that word for a long time. It went into the operating system the way things do when you hear them from someone you love. I want you to know that I've taken it out, all the way out. There's nothing of it left." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you that not to make you feel worse, but because it's true, and because I think you deserve to know the scope of the damage your words do. Not just that word, the accumulation of them, over years." He was quiet. She could see him sitting with it, not defending, not deflecting, just receiving it. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out rough. "I know it's not nothing," she said. "An apology from you isn't nothing, even now. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't land at all." She paused. "But I also need you to understand that I'm not here to forgive you so that you can feel better. I'm here because I have things to say that are mine to say, and this conversation is for me as much as it is for you." "Okay," he said quietly. "The 9 years weren't entirely wasted," she said. "I've thought about this a lot. The early years were real. I was real in them, and I believe you were too, in the way you were capable of being. But somewhere in the middle of it, you decided that I was a supporting character in your story rather than the main character in my own, and you stopped adjusting for the reality of who I actually was. I became the version of me that was convenient to you." "Yes. And I let that happen. I want to be honest about that. I didn't leave when I should have. I stayed and shrank and waited for something to change that was never going to change because I was the only one who wanted it to." She looked at him steadily. "That's on me. Not all of it, but my portion of it." Something shifted in his expression. She thought it was gratitude. The specific, complicated gratitude of someone who has been offered honesty instead of a version of events that places all the weight on one side. He was wrong, and he knew it. And he needed to know she knew the full picture, and she'd given him that. "What you've built here," he said, after a moment. He looked at the studio again, at the light and the canvases and the entire physical reality of the life she'd constructed. The work, the life, all of it. What about it? "I went back into the installation at the gala, the second time knowing it was yours." He paused. "I stood in front of the last panel and I tried to find myself in it, to find where I was in the material." His voice had gone quieter. "I wasn't there." "No," she said. "You're not." I expected to feel it. Evidence of what I'd done, somewhere in the layers. He shook his head slightly. "But it wasn't about me. None of it was about me. That's right. You took everything that happened and made it about something else entirely. I took what happened and made it mine, she said. That's different from making it about something else. It was always mine. You were the circumstance, Damien. Important circumstance, formative circumstance, but not the subject. He sat with that. Outside the studio window, Harlow was doing what it did on a Friday afternoon in late spring. Unhurried, ordinary, a town that had never been shaped around the particular kind of urgency that Damien Cross carried as a permanent feature of his presence. She watched him feel the unfamiliarity of the quiet. Sabrina and I, he started. She held up one hand, not unkindly. I don't need that information. He stopped, reconsidered. Right. Whatever is or isn't happening in your marriage is yours to navigate. It has nothing to do with me. He nodded. Is there something you came here to ask me? She said. Specifically, not the art acquisition. We both know that wasn't the real reason. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something warm and specific in the studio, the way spring light does in a space with high windows, and it caught the side of his face and made him look, for a moment, less curated, more like a person. I wanted to know if you were okay, he said. Actually okay, not the statement, not the interview. I wanted to know if this, he gestured at the studio, the life, all of it, is what you actually wanted. She looked at the question for a moment, turned it over. Yes, she said simply. This is exactly what I wanted. I didn't know it was when I left. I knew I was leaving something that was wrong, but I didn't know yet what the right thing looked like. It looked like this. She glanced at the canvas against the north wall, at the gold vein settled in the lower third, at 5 years of mornings and decisions accumulated into something real. I'm not performing contentment for your benefit. I'm telling you what's true. He looked at her, and she could see him believing her, and she could see what it cost him to believe her. Not because he wished her harm, but because there's a specific pain in understanding that someone you failed is genuinely, thoroughly fine without you. That the damage you did was real, and its consequence was their freedom. Good, he said, and he meant it. She could hear it. They sat in the quiet of the studio for a moment. Not comfortable exactly, but not impossible either. The quiet of two people who have said the true things and are letting them settle. I should go, he said. Yes. He stood and pushed the chair back, and he looked around the studio one more time with an expression she couldn't fully categorize and didn't need to. He moved toward the door. Vanessa. She looked at him. The gold, he said, gesturing toward after the weather, in the lower third of the painting. I don't know anything about technique, but it looks like it's coming from inside the canvas rather than sitting on top of it. She looked at the painting. It is, she said. That's the point. He nodded once, and something in the nod held the whole weight of the conversation. All the years and the damage, and the 5 years after, and the strange, imperfect, necessary hour they'd just spent in this room. Then he walked down the stairs and out into the street, and she heard the car door and the engine and the particular sound of something expensive moving away on a quiet street. She stood in the studio alone and looked at the painting. The gold in the lower third had come from 12 layers of glaze applied over 4 weeks, each one thin enough to be nearly transparent, each one building on the last, the color accumulating depth. The way things accumulate depth when you give them enough time and enough patience and enough willingness to let the process be slow. It didn't look like labor. It looked like light. She picked up the palette knife and looked at the upper register, where there was still one passage that wasn't quite right. A band of color between the storm and the aftermath that needed to find its resolution. She'd been circling it for days, approaching and retreating, not wanting to force it. She looked at it now and understood what it needed. Sometimes you have to clear out the noise before you can see a thing clearly. She began to work. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, the light shifting its angle across the floor the way it did in late spring, elongating, going gold in its own way. The studio was warm and quiet and smelled of linseed oil and the particular mineral sharpness of fresh paint, and the canvas against the north wall was almost what it was meant to be. She didn't think about Damien driving back to the city. She didn't think about what he would tell Sabrina or what would happen in the rooms of his life that she no longer had access to and no longer needed access to. She didn't think about the photograph or the coverage or the collectors waiting for conversations or the Chicago wing going up in 18 months. She thought about the passage in the upper register, about what color lies between storm and aftermath when the painter refuses to lie about how hard the distance between them is. She found it in the third stroke, after the weather sold in September. Not at auction, not through the drama of a bidding room, but quietly, the way Vanessa had come to prefer things moving. A collector named Dorothy Fenn, a retired architect from Portland who had driven 4 hours to see the Providence retrospective on its opening weekend, stood in front of the painting for 40 minutes without speaking to anyone. Then she found Jonah near the entrance and asked him, in a voice that suggested she was already prepared to be told no if the piece was available. It was. Vanessa had decided not to hold it for a larger market. Dorothy Fenn was 71 years old and had spent 40 years designing buildings and understood, without needing it explained, what it meant to make something from the inside out. She paid what was asked without negotiation, and when Jonah called Vanessa with the news, Vanessa was in the studio starting the first piece of a new series, and she said, "Good. Tell her it's going to a good home." The Providence retrospective ran for 6 weeks and was reviewed in 4 publications, 2 of them national. The most important review, the one that Constance printed and left on the studio work table without comment, opened with a paragraph that said, in part, that Vanessa Hale's work belonged to the tradition of artists who transform private devastation into public meaning, not by resolving the devastation, but by insisting on its honesty, and that the retrospective was the most compelling argument she'd encountered all year that beauty and survival were not opposites but the same thing seen from different distances. Vanessa read it once, sitting on the studio floor with her coffee. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered without being for display, alongside her grandmother's letters, and the photograph of herself at 22 in the RISD studio, covered in paint and grinning, believing entirely in what she was doing without yet knowing how difficult it would be to keep believing. She kept it because it was true, not because she needed validation. She'd learned slowly and imperfectly the difference between the two. Validation is what you want from other people because you can't find it in yourself. The truth is what you recognize when someone else manages to articulate what you already knew. The news about Damien and Sabrina arrived in fragments, the way news about people you're no longer close to always does, through the ambient information system of shared social circles and occasional media coverage, and, in this case, Petra, who tracked these things with the thoroughness of a woman who had watched her closest friend spend 9 years slowly disappearing and had opinions about the people responsible. They announced a separation, Petra told her, on a Sunday call in October, about 4 months after the gala. It's in the business press because of the foundation implications. Very controlled statement. Mutual decision, respect for each other, commitment to their shared work, the whole choreography. Vanessa was sitting in the small yard behind her studio building, a space she'd planted with late-season herbs and a climbing rose that hadn't bloomed yet but showed every sign of intending to. The afternoon was cool and bright, the particular October light that makes everything look like a decision. "How do you feel about that?" Petra asked. She considered the question with the real attention it deserved rather than deflecting it. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "Something like confirmation of what I already knew, that what they had was built on the same foundation as what Damien and I had in the last years. Surface tension, enough to hold until something pressured it. The gala pressured it. Maybe. Or it was already going. The gala just made things visible that were already true." She pulled a leaf off the herb nearest her. Rosemary, the smell of it sharp and clean on her fingers. "I didn't wish it on them. I want to be honest about that too." I know you didn't. But I'm also not going to pretend I'm devastated." A pause. "The only thing I actually feel is something like relief that it's no longer my problem to understand." Petra laughed. "The kind that comes from genuine recognition. That," she said, "is either the healthiest thing you've ever said or the most understatement I've heard in years." Probably both. After the call, she stayed in the yard for a while, not thinking about anything specific, just being in the light. The climbing rose had 3 new shoots coming off the base. She noted this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has learned to pay attention to small progressions, because small progressions are what everything is made of. The Chicago installation opened in March. The Webb Foundation's new wing was everything Marcus had described. The space designed with the seriousness of people who understood that art requires room to breathe, the lighting calibrated over 3 days of adjustments with Vanessa and the Foundation's technical team working side by side until it was exactly right. The horseshoe configuration of Reclamation was oriented slightly differently than it had been in Tribeca. The final large panel now faced the entrance to the wing, so it was the first thing you saw when you walked in and the last thing you saw when you left. Vanessa flew to Chicago for the opening. She stayed 4 days. The opening night reception was quieter than the Remington Gala. More focused, less performative, the guests predominantly collectors and curators and artists and educators who were there because the work was the point. She spent most of the evening in conversation, which was her preference. Not the social performance variety, but the real kind. Ideas moving back and forth, people saying things she hadn't thought about, and her saying things that surprised even herself. A woman named Serena Okafor, who ran an arts education program for underserved Chicago youth, stood with Vanessa in front of the final panel for a long time without speaking, and then said, "My students are going to lose their minds in here." In a good way? In the best way. The kind where they don't have words for what they're feeling, and then they go home and make something because they have to get it out somehow. The Serena looked at the texture of the panel, the compressed layers, the encaustic wax, the fabric from history is now transformed. That's what good art does to young people who are already carrying a lot. It tells them the carrying can become something. Vanessa looked at the panel. That's the truest thing anyone has said about this work. It's what I see in it. Serena paused. Would you ever consider coming to talk to the program? Not a formal lecture, just come into the room with them. Let them ask questions. Yes, Vanessa said, without the deliberation she usually brought to new commitments. Yes, I'd like that. She didn't know, standing there, that the conversation with Serena Okafor would become one of the more significant of her career. That she would go to that program not once but 6 times over the following 2 years, that some of those students would go on to apply to art schools they'd been told weren't for people like them, that one of them would eventually intern in her Harlow studio and turn out to be ferociously talented in a way that made Vanessa think about Jonah, who'd been ferociously talented when she found him, and about Britt Hayward, who'd bought a painting before she talked herself out of it, and about all the people along the way who had recognized something in the work and extended their hand and made the next thing possible. She didn't know any of that yet. She just said yes. The second year after the gala was different from the first in a way that was hard to articulate, but that she felt in the daily texture of things. The first year had been reactive, responding to the wave of attention, managing the new scale of visibility, keeping the work at the center while the surrounding noise tried to pull focus. The second year was quieter in the way that comes after you've made your decisions and committed to them, and the world has adjusted to the shape of those decisions. She was making new work, a series she'd been thinking about for months, different in character from Reclamation. Less dense, more expansive, the surfaces thinner, and the space between elements more deliberate. She was interested now in what happens after reconstruction. Not the breaking and the rebuilding, which she'd explored fully and felt she'd said what she had to say, but the life that comes after rebuilding. The ordinary, specific, sometimes boring, sometimes unbearably beautiful fact of a life that belongs to you. She talked about it with Dr. Mackey in their Thursday sessions, and she talked about it with Jonah while they worked, and she talked about it with Petra on Sundays, and she wrote about it in the notebook she kept on the work table. Not journals exactly, more like thinking on paper, the kind of writing that isn't for anyone but yourself and functions as a way of locating what you actually believe under everything you've been told to believe. I keep hitting this question, she told Dr. Mackey one afternoon, about what I owe the difficult years, like, am I allowed to move past them, or do I have to keep the wound open because it's what made the work? Dr. Mackey looked at her with the particular attention she gave to questions she found important. What do you think? She asked, which was the answer she gave when she wanted Vanessa to find her own. I think I've been treating the difficulty as the source, like the pain is the engine, and without it nothing gets made. She looked out the window of the office at the ordinary street below. But that's not actually true anymore. I made something real. I made it from the wreckage, but the wreckage isn't what made it real. The work made it real. The choosing to do it every day, even when it wasn't coming from pain, especially then. And what does that mean for the question of what you owe the difficult years? That I don't owe them my permanent residence, she said. I can honor them without living in them. Dr. Mackey made the small sound she made when something was exactly right. That's a significant distinction. I know. Vanessa almost smiled. I'm a slow learner. You're a thorough learner, Dr. Mackey said. Those aren't the same thing. The clarity that had come for Vanessa in waves over 5 years, and then in a different quality of wave over the 2 years after the gala, was not the kind of clarity that arrives clean and stays clean. That was one of the things nobody tells you about the process of rebuilding a life. It doesn't complete. It doesn't arrive at a point where everything is resolved and the questions stop coming and you live in the answer. It keeps being a process. The difference is that the process stops being an emergency. She was 44 years old. She was not the 22-year-old in the RISD studio, paint-covered and certain. She was not the woman who had stood in a borrowed dress in her own home and felt something in her chest stop moving. She was not even entirely the woman who had walked into the Remington Gala in emerald silk with 5 years of work behind her and the ground solid under her feet. Though that woman was much closer, and she was grateful to her for what she'd done. She was the person who had come through all of those versions and was still in the process of becoming whoever came next. She was imperfect in specific ways she'd cataloged carefully enough to know which ones she was working on and which ones were just going to be hers. She was a woman who worked long hours and sometimes forgot to eat and had a complicated relationship with her own ambition and still, occasionally, caught herself wanting external validation when what she meant was internal permission. She was someone who had learned, with real difficulty and real cost, the difference between being loved and being managed, between being seen and being kept, between a life that accommodates who you are and a life that requires you to disappear so someone else can be comfortable. These were things she knew now. They were in the body the way things that cost something to learn tend to settle, not as thoughts, but as instincts, reflexes, the kind of knowing that doesn't require remembering because it lives in how you move through rooms and make decisions and choose, every day, in the small, ordinary ways, who you're going to be. Jonah left the studio in April of the second year, not abruptly, not badly, but because he'd been accepted to a residency program in Berlin, and it was exactly the right thing for him, and they both knew it. She threw a small party in the studio the week before he left, 6 or 8 people who had become the texture of her working life in Harlow, and they drank reasonable wine and talked about work the way people do when they love it. And when Jonah hugged her goodbye, he said, "I wouldn't have applied without watching you." She didn't ask what he meant because she didn't need to. She understood what it means when someone's choices, witnessed closely enough, teach you something about what's possible. She hired a new assistant in May, a woman named Cass, 24, with a background in textiles and an obsessive interest in material history that made her immediately useful in ways that were different from Jonah's usefulness and equally necessary. The studio found a new rhythm. The work kept being made. She was in the studio on a Tuesday morning in early June, the 2nd June after the gala, almost exactly 2 years, when she got the call from Constance that the new series had been acquired by the Art Institute of Chicago for their permanent collection. Not a temporary exhibition, not a loan, permanent collection. She sat down on the floor of the studio when she heard it, which she hadn't planned to do. Cass was at the materials table behind her, working on a textile sample, and she said very quietly, "Vanessa, you okay?" "Yes," Vanessa said from the floor. I need a minute." Cass had the good instincts to give her the minute without filling it. She sat on the studio floor and looked at the space around her, at the paintings in progress against the walls, at the materials and the high windows, and the north light coming in with the particular quality it had on clear June mornings, at the small imperfections of the space, the corner where the paint had chipped off the baseboard, and she'd never gotten around to fixing it, the work table that leaned slightly because one leg had been repaired with a shim that worked but wasn't invisible, the radiator, different from Earl's clanging monster, but still not entirely quiet, ticking softly in the corner. She had built all of this. Not in the triumphant sense, not in the version of the story where someone rises from hardship to magnificence in a series of clean victories. In the actual sense, day by day, winter morning by winter morning, canvas by canvas, choice by choice. She had built it out of the ruins of something that hadn't deserved her, and what she'd built was real and specific, and hers in the way that only things you make entirely from your own hands and your own insistence ever truly are. She thought about the question she'd written on a card with a fountain pen 9 years ago, pressing a dried leaf into the envelope. I still choose you. Do you still choose me? She understood now, sitting on the floor of her studio in the clean June light, what she'd been asking and what the real answer had always been. It was never about whether Damien chose her. The question was always whether she would choose herself. Whether she would choose the woman who had put a leaf in an envelope and asked to be seen, and then keep choosing her. Through the leaving, through the rented room, through the first terrible winter and the canvases and the small sales and the building of something real from nothing, keep choosing her all the way to here, to this floor, to this light, to the permanent collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, to the permanent, unassailable fact of a life she had chosen rather than endured. She had chosen herself. Imperfectly, slowly, with significant detours and more nights than she could count when the choosing felt like an act of stubbornness rather than faith. But she had done it. She got up off the floor. Cass looked at her with the waiting expression of someone who has sensed something significant happened, but doesn't know what. The Art Institute is taking the new series, Vanessa said, for the permanent collection. Cass's face broke into the open, uncomplicated delight of a 24-year-old who hasn't yet learned to manage her own joy in professional settings. Are you serious? Yes? Vanessa, that's incredible. She looked like she was trying to find a word large enough and coming up short. That's everything. Vanessa looked at the paintings on the walls. It's a lot, she said. It's not everything. She picked up her brush. Everything is a lot more complicated and smaller and better than that. Cass looked at her for a moment. That should be on a wall somewhere. Maybe, Vanessa said, and she turned back to the canvas she'd been working on, the new series, the work that was about what comes after, and she made the next stroke, and then the next. And the morning moved forward, the way mornings move forward, when you are doing the work you are supposed to be doing and you know it. In November of that year, she was asked to give the keynote address at an arts education conference in Boston. A 3-day gathering of educators, administrators, and working artists convened around the question of how creative practice survives institutional pressure. She almost declined. She was not, by temperament or training, a public speaker. She was someone who communicated through objects, through surfaces, through the compressed vocabulary of material and light. But Serena Okafor was also speaking at the conference. And when Serena called her personally and said, "There are going to be a lot of young women in that room who need to hear from someone who left and rebuilt and didn't perform confidence they hadn't earned," Vanessa said yes. She wrote the talk herself, over 3 weeks, in the notebook she kept on the work table. She didn't perform it. She stood at the podium in a room of 300 people and said what was true, in the plainest language she could find. She talked about what it costs to let someone else define the value of your work, about how the cost is never just professional, how it gets into the body, into the way you sleep, and the way you move through rooms and the questions you ask yourself at 3 a.m. She talked about the difference between a life that is comfortable and a life that is yours, and why comfort sometimes works against you by making the distance from yourself tolerable when it shouldn't be. She talked about the rented room with the mustard yellow walls and the clanging radiator and the blank canvas she'd sat in front of for an hour, unable to begin, understanding that inability to begin as the full measure of what she'd let be taken. And then she talked about the beginning, the single rust-red mark across the middle of a canvas on a cold November night with nothing behind her and nothing ahead. The way beginning is always the hardest part because it requires you to believe before any evidence that you have something worth saying. The evidence comes later, she said, if you're lucky and if you're willing to do the work. But the beginning, the act of picking up the brush or the pen or whatever your particular instrument is, that has to come before the evidence. It has to come out of something that is not proof and not certainty, but just the stubborn, irrational refusal to accept that you are finished. The room was quiet, in the way a room gets quiet when everyone in it is doing something private. "I want to say one more thing," she said, "about the people who tell you that what you're doing isn't worth doing, about the voices, internal or external, that catalog your limitations and present them as your permanent address." She looked at the room, at the educators and artists and young women Serena had described, and the young men too, and the older ones, the ones who had been carrying something similar for decades. Those voices are very convincing. They often belong to people who love you, or say they do. They often know exactly where to press. And the worst of them, the ones that do the most damage, are the ones you eventually internalize so completely that they start sounding like your own. She paused. The rust-red mark across the canvas. That's the answer to all of them. Not the argument, not the defense, not the decade of building a body of work that proves you were worth something all along. Just the mark. The act of making it. The decision, in that specific moment, to put something of yourself into the world, regardless of whether it will be received, regardless of what you've been told about your own worth. She looked at the room one more time. You don't have to know what you're doing. You just have to begin. The applause that followed was the kind she'd learned to receive without deflecting. Not modestly, not with false surprise, but with the simple human acknowledgement that something had been said that landed, and that landing mattered. She turned 45 in December at the studio, with Petra and Cass, and a handful of people who had become the real furniture of her life. No party, exactly. Just people she loved, in a space she'd built, with decent food from the Italian place 3 blocks over, and wine that was actually good this time, Constance having mailed a case from a vineyard she favored with a card that said, in Constance's characteristically economical handwriting, "For years of excellent decisions." Petra made a toast that was embarrassing in its accuracy and made Vanessa laugh until her eyes watered, and Cass brought a cake that was lopsided in a way that suggested genuine effort rather than bakery purchase. And someone put music on the studio speakers, and at some point in the evening it became, without anyone deciding it, a real celebration, the kind that doesn't require planning because the actual content is already there in the room, in the people and the years, and the specific accumulated weight of having made something real. She stood for a moment near the north windows, looking out at Harlow doing its evening thing, the ordinary lights of ordinary lives, the river she could just see at the edge of the buildings if she pressed close to the glass. She thought about the penthouse windows on Park Avenue and the version of herself who had pressed her forehead to them and felt like she was floating above the noise of the world, like the city belonged to her in some small way. She thought about how wrong she'd been about what belonging meant, that it wasn't about altitude or address, not about the particular magnificent view from someone else's height. It was about this specific street, these specific people, the lopsided cake, and Petra's accurate toast and the paintings on the walls made from her own hands and her own refusal. It was not a perfect life. It was not what she would have chosen at 22 or 32 or even 39, the night she'd stood in a penthouse with a suitcase. It had cost her real things, years she wouldn't get back. The particular grief of a love that had been real in its beginning and had corroded into something unrecognizable by its end. The long, slow work of extracting herself from a version of herself that had learned to make herself small. But it was hers. Entirely, irrevocably, without condition hers. Not given to her. Not luck. Not the intervention of anything outside herself. Built from her own insistence, her own willingness to begin again in a rented room in a town nobody had heard of, with a set of acrylics and a cold November night, and the single irrational decision to make a mark and see what happened next. She pressed her fingertips lightly to the glass. The city below, such as it was, a mill town remaking itself, ordinary and unheroic and exactly right, reflected a dim version of the lit studio back at her. She could see the room in the glass, the people in it, the canvases on the walls. She could see herself, not floating above anything, not elevated by someone else's success into an altitude she hadn't earned, just standing on her own ground, in her own light, in the life she had chosen after the life she'd left, and choosing it again. The way you choose something every day, not because the choice is guaranteed to hold, but because you know now that you're capable of making it. She turned back to the room. Petra caught her eye from across the studio and raised her glass with the expression she'd been making for 30 years. The one that said, "I see you. I've always seen you. You are always going to be fine." Vanessa raised hers back. The music was playing. The cake was lopsided. The canvases on the walls were hers. The river was just visible at the edge of the buildings if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. This was the whole of it. Not a resolution, not an ending in the tidy sense, but something better. A life in motion. A woman in the middle of becoming, with the specific, hard-won knowledge that the becoming never stops, and that this, finally, was not a loss but the point. She had come through the fire, not unburned but burning cleaner, and she was still making the mark.